right. What an audience. Let's see here if we can get the slides up as well. All right. Hi, everyone. You know when you go to big music concerts and, you know, with famous stars like Patti Smith or, you know, Lady Gaga, they always have these bands that open up, you know, that you don't want to see, but you're there, you have to wait, you know, to enjoy them to see the real thing. I'm like getting a bit empathic with that idea right now. You know, you are like 750 more people here than my last presentation, which is very, very good. So I will seize this opportunity and get these 5 minutes with you to share my passion, my job, my big interest in life, which is providing shelters for forcibly displaced people. My name is Johan Karlsson. I'm heading a non-profit organization in Stockholm called Better Shelter. We started our organization in collaborations with the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and the IKEA Foundation. And essentially what we are doing is working out ways to provide people safe and dignified shelters to families who have been fleeing, you know, conflict and natural disasters. The couple behind us here, the wedding couple, there are 2 other people that we have worked with. This picture is from Baharka in Suleimania in Iraq, the Kurdish region. They had just fled from the central parts of Iraq from Daesh, or IS, and relocated at the Baharka refugee camp. Life goes on. We tend to think of forced displacement as something very temporary, which is true. There is an emergency to it. Yet, life goes on, people marry, people get old, people have children in forced displacement. And this is a great example of this. See if we can get the second slide here. Yeah. This happens at scale. These images from a recent project that we did with UNHCR in northwest Syria. 7,000 units was built over the duration of a few months. We have today 100 million people displaced globally. 100 million. I think that's a figure worth considering. That's 10 times the country I'm from, Sweden. And when I started working in Humanitarian Shelter, this figure was 42 million. If we're looking ahead for projections for 2050, the United Nations is estimating around 250 million people having been forced to leave their homes. There are other sources which actually tells us it's going to be up to 1 billion people. And regardless who is right here, that providing adequate, safe, and dignified shelters to families is it is what I would say the key challenges of our generation. So, if you were to flee tonight, where would you go? What would you do? You have a couple of hours to choose what to bring with you and where to head. If this would happen where I live, in Stockholm, my first-hand option would likely be, you know, to go to my friends in southern Sweden, stay with them. If that would not be secure, well, I will probably try to get the guts and call some friends who are living in southern Europe. You know, maybe Norman Foster would have a couch available where I could crash for a couple of days. This is how the main part of these 100 million people manage displacement. They are not depending on camps like these. They are working with their host families, with their host communities. But there is an increasingly and a very large proportion that doesn't have this luxury, that cannot travel cross borders, that don't have friends living too far where they can stay safe. And that's when we need to provide safe and dignified shelters like these. In northwestern Syria, where this is from, we're having 800,000 people living in tents like these ones. Again, we think of camps as something temporary. This conflict has been ongoing for 11 years. 11 years. The aid community is replacing tents with tents. So, and it's not a quick, this is not an exception. The average duration for displacement, the average duration for refugee today is 26 years. Let's see, I'm trying to figure out where the computer is and hitting this one. So, this is another example. The picture I just showed you from northwest Syria, it's actually one of the most well-funded humanitarian organizations. Almost 45% of their budget appeals were met last year. Sub-Saharan Africa, the same figure is below 10%. And funding is not increasing. So that's why, because of the trends that we are seeing, the high needs that are growing, the funds that are not following, the long duration in protracted crisis, it's a huge task for us to resolve. Humanitarians and industrial designers like me, but also the architecture community like you here in this room today. The most things remains to be done. I'm very super proud of what we have been able to achieve thanks to our partners at Better Shelter. We have provided more than 70,000 shelters like these ones across the globe. South America, Venezuela response, Middle East, Afghanistan, Europe, Ukraine. But we are not even the tip of the iceberg. We are like a snowflake on the iceberg. The magnitude of the crisis we are seeing today is huge. And I would like to go back to our wedding couple in Iraq and just remembering that temporary locations are far from, or temporary displacement is far from temporary most of the time. People are born, they grow up, they marry, they get kids, they pass away in temporary shelters. This is a huge task for architects to address, to help us and the humanitarian community get much better at what we are doing. Pleased to be here today with some brilliant minds and architects to share reflections on the practice they are doing and see how we can improve this going forward. Because as I said, this really is the challenge of our generation. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Elena Giral, our first speaker with the longest title possible I've ever seen. She's working with, you will be able to present what you're doing. I'm just going to try to get it right. The Emergency Shelter Division at rescEU at the European Commission. Right. So Elena is an architect, but today working with the European Commission, developing both, well, you will tell them, policies and funding for humanitarian interventions. So I'm happy to leave the stage for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Johan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Buenas tardes a todo el mundo. Before I started working in the emergency sector, building shelters, even I think before I started studying to be an architect, I had this thought, I had this dream, because I was very impacted by the tsunami in Indonesia in 2004, and I was very shocked by those images, and I thought, one day I'll become an architect, and then I will contribute to create this fantastic shelter that will hopefully help a lot of people. But I was wrong. I was very wrong because I didn't understand the complexity of this task. I will talk about shelter as a people-centered process rather than a design. Because a few days ago, the United Nations announced that we've reached the very shameful figure of 100 million people displaced, as Johan just told us. This is more than 1% of the world population. And there are thousands of architects in the world, and there are thousands of international organizations that are working on this task. And there are billions of euros that are put into this, and yet this happens. Afghanistan is a crisis that has been going on for 40 years of crisis, 5.8 million internally displaced people, 6.5 refugees abroad, 24 million people in need of humanitarian aid. And this is their house, this is their home. And I don't know why my presentation is moving alone, so pardon for that. This is a home for a lot of people that unfortunately have to live in these circumstances. And I'm here to say that shelter, it is not just a roof. Shelter is your access to water, to sanitation, to food. It's how do you go to school? How do you wake up in the morning? How do you put your children to bed at night? Shelter is much more than just one roof. In the best case scenario, people get this. This is Kenya. We have more than 500,000 refugees from Somalia, South Sudan, the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, neighboring countries. This is what people get because the humanitarian community does not understand the importance of inhabiting a space and how the quality of a space can impact or destroy your life. Providing shelter, however, is not about providing units, it's about much more. And we cannot keep ignoring this. I do not have a magic answer, but I can see a few problems. We cannot keep putting design at the center of whatever we think. Design is important, don't take me wrong, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing are people. We should put people at the center of whatever we do. People within their context, and then potentially talk about design. And then we have to take into account many things, like time. As Johan was saying, this goes on for a very long time. This is Zarqa in Jordan. 760,000 refugees. This was a Palestinian settlement that started in 1948 and eventually got engulfed by the city. We need to think about isolation. If we put people in a POC, this is a protection of civilian camp, where over 1.6 million people are internally displaced, the whole country, of course. What is the impact of putting people in isolation, in a fenced space, becoming victims of our own support? We have to think about access when we provide shelter. This is Haiti. 40% of the population are in need of humanitarian assistance, and sometimes the roads are not an option. So when you provide shelter, how are you going to make it there? In many cases, by boat. We have to think about local impact. What is your shelter going to provide to this community, and how is it going to affect it? How is it going to affect the environment? That is very important. Are you going to touch upon water resources, food resources? And also, is it going to cause a conflict? In this image, I deliberately put these women carrying wood, because in South Sudan, I saw a very good project where we were providing sustainable stoves for cooking for the families. However, the women, on the way to getting that wood for the stoves, were being aggressed, because the local population also needs that wood, because they are already very deprived on their resources. We need to think about scale. Satari camp is the 4th largest city in Jordan. Think about the scale of what is happening. Think about the dimension. We need to think about protection, and not only providing water and sanitation or hygiene for people. We need to think about what is happening when you're trying to go to the toilet and you come from a Muslim community that has been largely displaced, in Bangladesh you have the Rohingya ethnic group. And this is Kutupalong. This is a settlement with more than 800,000 people. That is several times the city where I grew up. And the women are being aggressed on the way to the toilet, something so simple as that. Because there is no light to go there at night, and because there is no privacy, they cannot go during the day, because nobody thought about their own protection and privacy. And you have to think about risk. You have to think of what is going to happen when the monsoon comes again, because the monsoon will come again. We have to think about services, because camps are cities, and they need services. This is Uganda, Chaka 2, a settlement in the west of Uganda, where people are paying with mobile money. They are not this helpless, deprived people. They grow, they develop, and they need services. And then we have to think also about alternatives. This is also shelter, and as Johan was pointing very rightfully, shelter is not about those units, it's about how people get displaced. But the good news is that we're in a room full of architects, and the world has thousands of brilliant architects. And it also has thousands of brilliant emergency professionals with whom I work that understand the complexity of providing emergency support. However, there is a gap in between, because architects are not sufficiently prepared to understand the complexity of humanitarian settings, and emergency responders are not sufficiently prepared to understand the complexity of inhabiting a space. So we need to bridge that gap, and we need to talk about it, and we need to teach more. And this is why I really want to thank the Norman Foster Foundation, because they brought us here to talk about something that we do not speak about in school. When I was an architect, nobody ever told me about this. And the UN just told us last week that there are 100 million displaced people in the world. And we can simply not keep doing business as usual. Thank you very much. How do you want to say it?
All right, we can. Yeah, I think we can pick whatever seat we want. So.
Good. Choice.
Yeah, we keep some COVID safe distance there.
Keep the distance, Johan.
Thank you very much, Elena. It was a very interesting presentation that you just made. There are a few things that strikes my mind as we listen to you, and that is the scale of the problem and the difficulty to address it. Obviously, the drive is there that you have it, and I think the number of people in this room that are interested in this cause demonstrate that people do care. But again, to be honest, also the field to the large extent looks today very much like it did when I started working here, like 10, 13 years ago. There's a lot of things that needs to be done. What would you say are the common pitfalls or bottlenecks that are sort of hindering development? You know, and I think that's my first question. And the second question would be, what would be the success factors if we would sit down here 10 years from now and really demonstrate some solid progress?
Yes. Well, I think that the main problem that I identify, and I was talking about it when I was saying we should bridge the gap, is that there is a gap. It is not a lack of resources, it is not a lack of knowledge, it is really about something so basic as talking to each other. We need that people stop thinking in a very squared way where they only work in what they've learned. And we need to really foster knowledge, cross knowledge of different disciplines. That, I think, is the main bottleneck, because then it comes to layers and layers of administrative procedures, and it is so simple as just putting people together and making them work together. So what we should really do is do more of this. We should think, and we should do things that we're not supposed to think. You should completely rebel from whatever you tell you that you are doing and try other things, because that is the only way that we actually see how wrong we were in the first place and how we can actually grow in a different direction.
Yeah, and doing this and really gathering architects to work in for the field, and putting the user first. I think one question that leads me to think about is, well, how well are we, if I may say so, in the global north, discussing these challenges and addressing them? What role do you think we can take? Because I think one thing that is very much discussed in the humanitarian aid world is, of course, localization. That we want to go local, we want to be site-specific, because cultures are context-specific, culture is very specific, geographic conditions are specific. How can we play this and use, I would say, your skills, because I'm not an architect, your skills as an architect, in order to improve the situations without sort of being, ignorant of the local needs?
Well, I think it all goes first down to education again. I think if we have a certain knowledge, we should share it. So architects do have that knowledge, and I think they should share it. However, it is very important that we do not do it in a top-down way. We need to listen to the actual people. We need to think about context. I think we need to learn much more about other contexts and the way people live and what are their primary needs. Because we tend to be right and we take assumptions on other cultures. So it is very hard to find the balance, but I think that as long as we approach the problem in a humble way, and there are very good examples, and we've heard them today too, about how to approach things in a humble way, however, also thinking about scale. We, as one, cannot deliver, and we are talking about enormous figures, so we need to think on scale. We need to think about how to transfer knowledge and how to consult and how to involve the population, because from my experience, if you do not involve local population, especially in those very dramatic scenarios, they will never accept what you are providing. So thinking for the people and with the people is, I believe, the only way forward.
And is that something that we normally can afford? I'm just seeing like a lot of emergencies, they really strike quickly. As I said, like in Northwest Syria right now, we have 800,000 people in acute need, even though we have been there for 11 years. You know, the needs are there. Or people crossing border, like what's happening in Uganda right now, for example. Like this, working out the site-specific, planning, getting involved with people. Is that something that is a realistic scenario if we're looking at projection of not only 100 million people, but 200, 250 million people displaced?
Well, I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt. Yeah. I think emergency is very complex, and we've been discussing with all the students this week that the very beginning of an emergency, it is always chaotic, it is always complicated, and there are so many needs that if I've been working for several weeks and I barely can feed my children and you come and talk to me about participation, I will probably not be very receptive in that moment. So we have to understand context. And then we need to be prepared to respond. This is why I work every day, to be prepared to respond first. But then we need to do it in a way that is incremental. And I've been talking about process, the idea of shelter as process, because you will do whatever is necessary in the now, and then as soon as you can, bring in the local population and use their support to move forward without trying to impose whatever you think is right, however, supporting them in the good direction.
Yeah. I think one striking experience that I have, like, yes, as a humbling factor of the challenge that we are in is that the ability to provide, safe and dignified shelter and housing, it is often linked that there's a certain political will. I think we have learned, like from our post-World War II architecture, and rebuilding Europe, that we can build adequate shelter for the many quickly and with good quality. Within forced displacement, the will is not always there. I usually tell the story of when we were piloting our very, simple flat pack shelters in Lebanon, and our team went there to set them up. And 2 hours into the process, there comes basically a van with armed men and asks them to take it down, or we will take it down for you. We don't mind refugees at all, but not here in our backyard. So we're not really allowing, there's no political will to build something better. And I think often when we tell this story, then people are like, this is very cynical. How could these people react like that? But I think it's very, very true. And I usually make a metaphor, because it was actually right. This was the same time as we had a lot of, Eastern European immigrants in Sweden, in Stockholm. And they were staying in the forest behind my house. And our neighborhood were upset, because it was not that we didn't want refugees or migrants, but why do they have to stay here? Yeah. So that's a challenging factor, I think, which is a big difference from what we see like from post-World War II, like reconstruction. Like there's a lack of political will. How do we address that? Is there like a humanitarian camouflage that we need to have, that everything like looks very temporary, or what do you think? Because this is something that we could see. We could see this, basically in any conflict around, that this is a key factor to deal with.
Well, I think that goes much farther than the shelter itself. That is about systemic change, and it's about, again, there's this idea of using a problem as an opportunity, and I think that having enabling spaces and good policy to enable people to actually progress within an emergency is the very first step. And I've seen contexts like Uganda. I've been sharing this with the students the whole week. In Uganda, they have the most open refugee policy in the world. People can work, people can send their kids to school, they can own land. And then it is still a refugee response, but people can flourish, they can progress. And I was visiting the settlement I was showing in the pictures, and I found a lot of local Ugandans that had shops in the settlement, and they were making a profit out of it, and they were very happy, because now they could sell much more corn they were selling before. I think we need to stop seeing refugees as others. They are just more of the same. And I know it sounds very naive, but it's true, we're all people. So I think that we need a systemic change, and we need, of course, to work in all stages of shelter and all stages of emergency, because it is not only about shelter, it's not only about emergencies, it's about social housing, it's about adequacy. So we really need to change the way we perceive others and understand once and for all that if everybody progresses, actually everybody progresses.
Yeah. So it's about as much changing the narrative as much as providing the solutions.
A lot.
And one question, like, we are a room full now of architects. If we want to engage in this field, how do you do? How do you go about it? Where do you start?
It is very complex. As I said, I'm an architect myself. I was very disenchanted with the profession very early on. And I have found that just the best is to really have architects which are very well prepared people. You are creative, you are resourceful, you are problem solving, doing something that is completely different, that is not architecture. And I call it sort of infiltrate the system. If we had architects joining the humanitarian sector, much more, there are architects out there, of course, but many more that would actually be able to infiltrate the system and then progress and make it to positions of power where they would actually make well-funded decisions, because that is the other side of the coin. The people that have a lot of emergency knowledge do not necessarily understand the key of inhabiting a space and the subtlety of designing for the people. So if we were to tell the architects that there are so many other things that can be done than just being an architect in just a regular architecture office, which is very good, but it's not enough. So we need to utilize the enormous potential to infiltrate a system and then try to just simply work in other causes, joining NGOs, going in the field, seeing the reality, learning about it, getting interested about other things that are much farther than your own backyard, or not even, because sometimes they are in your own backyard. Well, I think we just need to learn about many other things, and these things are not taught in architecture school, unfortunately.
And do we have reasons to be optimistic? It's a very gloomy picture that we have painted here today. What are the rays of light that we should hold on to?
Well, I do think so. I think that we are investing a lot in this. I think there are resources, and as I said, there are many good ideas and there are many good professionals. I see more and more conversation about it. I think that especially the newer generations, and I see a lot of young people here, I mean, I include myself, we're still young people. I think that we have an interest. We have learned from mistakes that have been made in the past, from certain types of architecture that are very good but maybe obsolete, and we are understanding that the world needs you and needs many others to actually do something. The fact that we are organizing this with someone like Norman Foster is a clear sign. We are putting attention in a very important topic of conversation. So yeah, honestly, when I got the call about this, I got very optimistic because I said, finally we are talking about this. So yes, I am.
Very good. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions. If there are any questions from the audience here for Elena. Let's see. Yes, and I think we are having a microphone coming as well. Yes. Right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Elena. Very good presentation. Many thanks. I would like to know what is your opinion about the role of international organizations, for instance, United Nations, for addressing the shelter problem, but also the affordable housing. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's very complicated, and I don't work for the UN myself, so I think I also have to be a bit careful with what I say. I think the UN has an enormous potential. They are this very large organization that is able to contact people like Shigeru Ban, that I'm sure we'll talk about it in a minute. And they have the potential to do wonderful things. However, and I will be very critical about my own system, there's a moment that organizations become so large that information gets lost. And then I go back to bridging the gap. This is why we need the good information to get to the right place. I believe that we have, and I say the international community, not necessarily the UN, the international community has a lot of potential in actually changing things, if only they will listen to the right people, and the other way around. If the right people will understand what the UN and all the international organizations are really trying to communicate on. I believe we can change things. It's a slow change, and as Johan was saying, unfortunately, the figures get worse and worse, the numbers get larger and larger. But that's why I talk about systemic change, because we need to all change the way we think. And whenever we will be doing architecture, if it becomes the norm to think about people first, that becomes something that grows. It's like a little seed. So I think international organizations are an enabler for that to happen, but it's not their sole responsibility. It is about governments, it is about policy. So we all need to change. It's not only one side. Otherwise, they already have the power, they already have the money, and nothing is changing. Yeah. Something else needs to change.
I think if I may add, I think that one very powerful tool that architects have is the power to visualize ideas, yes. To synthesize them, to make them comprehensible. As you said, this is super complicated because it's like multinational, United Nations, bureaucracy, there's tons of layer here. But by showcasing a solution, seeing how it affects the people and having a dialogue with the affected people, that creates a very strong example that Redefining really can bridge this systemic change that we are doing. So really leading by example. That's what I would chip in. I think we have time for one more short question before going. Yeah? Thank you.
Hello, Elena. Thank you so much for amazing discussion. Okay, so I come from India and I relate a lot of things what you said. I have precisely one question with three things: material, scale, and maintenance. When you talk about the shelter, it seems that we are talking about a much smaller scale, but I think what we need to consider that 10,000 people moving together and two moving together, I think, so basically we are making cities or villages, so that's the scale. Material, I again see that we talk a lot about industrial material. What about going back to the vernacular? Is it possible to have a kit of vernacular, material which people can build it by themselves? And third is what about the maintenance? Because I think eventually people are organic, as already Matt mentioned. They're gonna grow, they're gonna marry, so they're gonna expand in the same home. So you're gonna see a lot of ephemeral things coming around the way. So what about the maintenance? So three.
Yes.
I hope it's not a too-long question.
Thank you. I deliberately left those things outside, but because, as you saw, I was talking about the process rather than the design. I wanted to leave the design, exaggerating a bit the word design, out of it, because what I wanted to say is that architects, any architect, if you put them with a problem, they will very quickly start thinking, oh, materials, oh, shapes and sizes and versatility. Those are things you already know. What you don't know, or not enough, is the complexity that comes behind. And I left outside the whole European mechanism I work for and the whole layers of the United Nations and the complication of dealing with international and local governments and regional governments. That is where complexity is. Of course, if you ask me, we should do things that are as local as possible with materials that are as sustainable as possible and as locally resourced as possible, and that we really put, again, the people in command because of scale. Because brilliant designs are fantastic, and expensive design can solve anything. We can build anything nowadays. That's where the problem is. That's where the complication is. Anybody can build with it unlimited money. It's not a problem. How do we build things that actually work for tomorrow, for 10,000 people that just crossed the border? That's where the problem is. So we do need to think materials, we do need to think local scale, we need to think, that is where the problem is. If someone had already cracked the system, we wouldn't be here, would we? So of course, that's where the complication comes in. But when there is no other way than to have something pre-stocked somewhere, because indeed you cannot locally build for 10, 15, 20,000 people in a day, then we have to think about making it as simple as possible so other people can build on that. And we need to count with your ideas to make design good, because otherwise we use tents. Everybody knows what a tent is. Tents have been used for years and years and years. They work, they're easy, they're cheap, they're discarded. So this is where you come in the conversation. How do we make something that is fast enough, simple enough, light enough, cheap enough, and that yet allows for people to grow in the future And that if that people manages, hopefully, to go back to their houses very shortly, what do we do with it? Do we dismantle it? Do we reuse it? Do we recycle it? Do we build a community center? Do we build social housing, adding this and that and that? Those are the right questions that the emergency sector is not asking enough. There are annoying people like me from below saying things, but we are not enough. We are nobody.
Thank you, Helena. This is great. I think what like trying to summarize it a bit is really like considering this as a process and not having the shelter really as a starting point where you deploy it. We tend to think a lot about deployment, right? Building quickly, getting them up there, but they're going to live there. They're going to be long. As you said, they're going to be upgraded. The families are going to change. They're going to relocate back and forth. So think of this as a process.
Yes.
I think a warm applause for Elena, and we're going to hand it over to our next two speakers. Thank you. And with this, I'm very, very glad and honored to present two architects that don't need really an introduction at all, who have worked a lot and done what there is to be done. I think if there's anyone who could shed some light and give us some look into the future about opportunities and possibilities, how we improve the situation, it would be Mr. Shigeru Ban and Sir Norman Foster. Please, welcome to the stage.
Right. You're in the middle.
Shall I sit in the middle this time? Okay, I've warmed this one up for you, so it's good. Okay, so very honored to be here. You have heard the previous speakers. You are two very aware of the situation in the world and also very much engaged, I would say, seeing the responsibility as an architect going really further than doing your normal practices, right? Like trying to really aim to improve the situation for people who are forcibly displaced. I have a few questions for you. It's very seldom that you get to sit with two gentlemen like this and get inspiration. So I thought I'm going to try to pick your brains a bit and on things to consider on how we can succeed in making shelter even better tomorrow, so that when we meet next time there will have been some progress. And I think the first question I have, I'm trained as an industrial designer, so I'm not an architect. As an industrial designer, it is really about, having the, Henry Ford, T. Ford model, that we are like designing, balancing user needs with production demands, and one design for the many, and you can have any color you want as long as it's black. That's the mentality that I come from and that developed this shelter that we just saw here. But as Elena told us, that in humanitarian sheltering, localization is always preferred, because we know that families are different, cultures are different. Like there is not a one silver bullet solution that goes and can be used for everyone. Add to this that the economy is local as well. So if we can design something that can be built with local materials, we're actually benefiting the community, the host community, who's often needing this the most, like rather than some production plant far away overseas. And the tricky thing I see here is that we know this, and I have known this for 10 years, and I'm still providing prefabricated units across the world. And we are doing it in the thousands. And that is because in the typical context we are working with, Yemen, Northwest Syria, Ukraine today, the supply chains are broken. It's very difficult to source. It's difficult to get the time to work with people and build bottom up. So we tend to get a bit brutalistic and ship in like prefabricated units. But as architects, how would you advise us and the rest of the humanitarian world to think differently? How would you think about this local versus global dilemma that we are seeing? Are we having the right approach, or should we change?
Well, I have started this kind of activity in 1994 when there is a crisis in Rwanda, genocide between two tribes, Hutu and Tutsi. And there cutting trees. Actually, the UN forced refugees to cut the trees to make a frame. Then UN just give them plastic sheet to cover. Because over 2 million people cut the trees, this became very serious deforestation. And then the UN provided aluminum pipes, but refugees sold them out for money. That is why they accepted my proposal to make a shelter out of recycled paper tube, which can be built. Actually, we tested it with the Maison Sans Frontières, bringing a small machine to the camp to produce the paper tube locally in the camp to make, instead of shipping over. Also, I found the paper tube company, capital of Rwanda, Kigali, but that is possible. But that time, I was told by UN, don't make something too fancy, just budget was only $50 US. Just they want them to go back to home as soon as possible. That's why my aim was just replacing wood out of paper tube. That was all. But now, as you know, that the same place, the north of Kenya, I was invited to design semi-permanent houses by Habitat, not UNHCR anymore. Because now, instead of the refugees go back to home so quickly, the situation getting worse, and they have to stay there 5 years, maybe 10 years. So this is no longer the job of the UNHCR. This becomes the role for the UN Habitat. So I was asked by UN Habitat to propose semi-permanent houses. But what I did was try to study the traditional construction method of the refugees, for example, South Sudanese. I made a research, what kind of houses, what kind of material they were using. Because I wanted to hire them, I wanted to give them the opportunity, employment opportunity to make the temporary houses or semi-permanent houses by themselves. Because always the problem is the maintenance. If we provide some prefab houses, after a few years, we need the maintenance, but we have to send somebody specialist to maintain. But if I use their traditional technology, which refugees have, they can build by themselves and they can maintain by themselves. So that was my new approach, studying their traditional construction method of refugees to make a house by themselves and maintain by themselves. That was kind of drastic change I have been facing.
So really about getting the people active and contributing themselves rather than passively handing them out.
Yes, this becomes an employment opportunity for them too.
Absolutely. Norman, I think one example I would like to give is if we're looking at in a situation right now, a typical prefab situation, I would say. Northwestern Syria, we are looking at need of 160,000 shelters within the next 2 years. This is quite significant in scale. Add to this that this is in one of the territories where it's very, very difficult to ship in and out materials. Supply chains are very limited, if at all, working. We are having 800,000 people there living in very dire situations right now. So this is what the United Nations is now targeting to achieve. If this would come to you as a breeze, where would you start? Or where would you guide us to start?
I think that during this week, we've become aware of the complexity, the nuances. Some emergency situations need something instantly. Others allow the time to be able to work locally. I guess that the words temporary and permanent need to be re-evaluated. In World War II, 75 years ago, prefab meant instant prefabricated housing. It was industrialized. The idea was that it would just last immediate post-war period. Those prefab estates are still very much around. And I think that there are so many themes going here. The idea, one of the things that we've discussed is that if it's an instant prefab, then it's going to be inferior, it's going to be substandard. And yet, some of the lessons of history would counter that. The Crimea is in the spotlight today because of its annexation, 2014. One war in the 19th century created prefabricated hospitals which were shipped out from the UK. They were designed by a nurse, essentially, a lady called Florence Nightingale. And it not only answered the needs of a field hospital, it revolutionized the design of hospitals afterwards on a permanent basis, anywhere. It explored cross-ventilation, it created new standards of hygiene. And one of the interesting things I think about our workshop this week is that we've been encouraging 3 teams, at least one team, to go beyond the kind of instant lightweight shelter and see whether affordable housing, which obviously is a big need, far removed from the instant need of refugees, but whether that could learn from it. And questioning, again, all the assumptions about lightweight structures. Discovering, for example, that you can get concrete in rollable sheets, like a fabric. You can put it over an inflatable. You can water it, literally with a watering can, and it hardens. So I think that in the end, the means to this has to be greater education, enlightenment by those at the political level to reach out to the professionals in the same way that in the emergency of a war, and this ought to be treated as an emergency like a war, when you have that pressure, politicians and go out to industry, get multidisciplinary teams, and what comes out of that process after the war then has a mass application in terms of peaceful requirements. But how do we engender the local element? If you challenge the idea that a refugee camp has to look temporary, it cannot look permanent, which I think is a great assumption to question right at the beginning, then you can use local materials like earth. As we know, you can use advanced technology of concrete mixers, additives. You can transform the nature of that. Those lessons have come out of, in our terms on the one exploration into this, which was the drone port for rural Africa, came out of the work that we did with NASA on Mars habitations, and the European Space Agency on lunar habitations. And it was using the local material, using the technology of formwork. In the case of the drone port, it was high-tech fiberglass rods. In the case of the moon, it was inflatables. And when you look at that, it looks like a new vernacular, because these habitations are the same red earth, in the same way perhaps using technology in Masdar. The materials are of the desert. So I think you can make, in the end it depends. If you've got 6 months, you can do something which you're never going to be able to do in 6 hours, which was the time in the foundation that we erected your thing.
Yeah.
But you're not promoting yourself. I mean, whatever one might or might not say about those units, they're a miracle. I mean, you challenge the tent. The tent has a 6-month life. And imagine living in a tent. I mean, you challenged the tent and done it at mass scale. I mean, it's a tremendous achievement.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much. I mean, we are building this step by steps. And I think we're all coming around, it's like what Elena also alluded to, we are in a system. right, of temporary assistance for marine. And there's a bit of a systemic change that is needed for us to allow us to be effective. You have done some work with the United Nations and other, Shigeru. Do you think we are close to achieving this change?
Well, actually, this Norman's point is very important. The one side is emergency situation. We have to bring something right, something easy to build, but it doesn't last too long. So instead of building something temporary, then we destroy it, or it can be damaged, then we put something more permanent one. But maybe, as you said, maybe using new technologies or new something, the temporary shelter can be improved as a semi-permanent and permanent houses in after 6 months with local material like mud and sand. So we just bring something very easy, quick, lightweight to bring immediately. It is important. Speed is very important. But maybe within half years, instead of changing, we can improve, we can renovate, or we can make it better for the semi-permanent use. That's using the new technology with local material.
I think also taking Elena's point, previous speaker, who is absolutely amazing, and if ever you wanted a demonstration of using your skills as an architect much more powerfully than actually designing, but rather enabling, somehow at whatever level of authorization or power, we have to think about these as communities, not just a collection of units. They're public spaces, the energy. We should be thinking about how we miniaturize energy. We do have that capability. It's another conversation. It's a nuclear battery, a trailer-sized unit, 10 megawatts that can power a small town, a refugee camp. So we have the technology, we have the information, we have the skills. The challenge is to harness that, to have a level of experimentation. Again, if this was treated as the war that it really is, then you would be going out to bids, to multidisciplinary groups, harnessed with industry, to show working prototypes with a range of criteria, because it's not one simple criteria. As we know, some of these things do have the time to involve a local community. But again, as we've heard this week, it's also about creating opportunities for jobs. And one of the teams who talked to us working on the border between Mexico and America was talking about how they were bringing the community of the migrants together with the local community. And then at one point we saw one of these camps completely enclosed by barbed wire with no work opportunities, complete exclusion. So I think that it has to be treated as a bigger issue, not just starting with a tent, but starting with the idea of a small town.
Absolutely. Shigeru?
The building community is actually the target, not just making house. And also involvement of the victims of refugees. And as I said, that is creating a new employee opportunity is very important. So the final goal is creating community, as Norman said.
I think, Shigeru, I mean, to your credit, you are one of the very, very few architects who've confronted this situation and made architecture out of crises.
I think even the temporary housing or shelter, it has to be beautiful.
Yes. I think that is a very... And you told us previously, Shigeru, that about permanent and temporary shelter, that if it's something that people love and take care of, I mean, it is temporary, even though it's, no, it's permanent, even though it's made out of temporary material, right? That goes it. I think that's a very good thought, because there is, of course, a constraint in many, like in conflict areas where we are typically working, is you're having your house, land, and property rights issues. Like you're building on ground that belongs to someone else, but the war has made them flee, so you cannot build anything permanent there because you don't own the land, right? It's occupied land. I think with your philosophy and what you have demonstrated in your work in building temporary in terms of choice of materials, that even that can be turned into something which is a very durable and pleasurable stay that people love and take care of. And that, if anything, I assume is the role of an architect. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's your point. Actually, that I'm trying to redefining the meaning of the temporariness and permanent. Mm. Because my experience, as you know, that in the big cities, there are so many commercial buildings in concrete, which can be destroyed in 10 years or 20 years or less. By the land is bought by other developer, they destroy the concrete building to put new one. So as long as the building is to make money, that's temporary, even in concrete. But many of the temporary houses, the church I built in paper, that's become permanent because people love it and they take care of it. So that's my definition of what is temporary and permanent. So.
Thank you very much.
I just thought that you both touched on something which is absolutely central to the issue. The informal settlements, which is 14% of humanity, and unless something changes, will be 1 in 3 by 2050, who don't have water, sanitation, and so on. That is transformed overnight when land ownership passes. In other words, when they're not squatting, but they have the potential for ownership. Yeah. So there are so many camps which are on government land, so the criteria which has been developed for the idea that somebody will give it a site temporarily, and therefore you can't put a concrete slab on it, and you can't do something which even looks permanent, that becomes transformed if the land belongs to that community. And of course, families want to get back where they were. They don't want to stay there. But as we heard, the reality is it can be 26 years. But surely there is a recycling. People will leave and other people will come. And if those buildings have the quality of a village or a town, which is the reality, then you would transform the quality of life. And I mean, that's a revolution waiting to happen.
No, absolutely, very much so. And I think there's one final question. We're a bit getting over time here I have for you, but it's very interesting. In the Humanitarian world, we have a standard that states how you should build. And one very popular term that I'll show you is about safety and dignity. They say that shelter should always be safe and dignified. It says that 160 times in the same standard, safe and dignified shelter. The problem is it never says what it is. So I would like, could you quickly, how would you interpret what would a safe and dignified shelter be? How would you read it?
It would be one that would give me privacy when I needed it as a family, but a sense of community, and not an isolated community, a community that was integrated into the bigger picture of that locality. Ideally, those residents would, as we've said, had a participation in the creation of that, so they would feel a sense of ownership. And it wouldn't have the stupidities of some of the restrictions at the moment, which are born out of perhaps minority examples. and it would face the reality of integrating this into agriculture, into work, into jobs. That would be more dignified rather than everybody sitting there for however many years twiddling their thumbs and living on aid.
Thank you very much. Shigeru Ban.
Dignity is a very important issue. If we just provide them something free, there's no dignity. That's why always I propose the system to be built by anyone, and bringing the victims or local people for the part of construction. If they are involved in the construction or method, they have dignity to own and to keep or maintain. So that I think dignity can be created by the involvement of the local people, the victims and refugees. And I think the providing dignity is very important even for the temporary shelter.
Thank you very much. Co-creation and participation as much as privacy. We have a few minutes to have some questions from the audience. If there are any. Yes, we have one question over here. We're going to see if we can get over a microphone.
So, hello. You talk about the question of dignity. And there's obviously this problem that when you have organizations like the United Nations, like various other NGOs going in and building these things, then once they leave, well, then what do you do with it? Does the community know how to necessarily take care of it, for example? So I was wondering how architecture can or how you can make architecture more inclusive for people there, for the inhabitants, to also know how to use it.
Well, as you said, inclusiveness is very important. So that's what I said, including or working with the local people, inclusiveness of the community, victims, local people, creating a new employment opportunity. The inclusiveness is really key word.
Yeah. So you get the skill transfer already that's when you're building it. Yeah?
I mean, if architecture is about raising the quality of life, then you can't get more to the fundamentals of architecture, of providing clean water, shelter, sanitation, dignified surrounding, creating a community. And if nothing else, this evening and this workshop, I think has brought a much wider awareness of the issue. And I think Elena has demonstrated the power of an architect working within the European Union to effect extraordinary change. So I hope that more architects see this as architecture and not something which is somebody else's business, like a politician or some hydraulic engineer or surveyor. It demands those skills.
Great. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? I think we have time for one or two more. Okay, we have one up here.
Hello. I would like to make a question regarding temporariness and permanency that you have spoken before. I am studying the camps, and what I have come to know is that the camps will become permanent as a paradigm shift from UN, right? From the UNHCR. So my question is about this shift of thinking that comes because they have become permanent in reality. So the idea is to change them to be permanent. So regarding this, I think it's a very important issue that, to me, it will change everything. It will change the way, the land property will have to change everything if that happens. So I would like to know your opinion. I would like to share this and know what you think about this.
Thank you very much. So the question about basically shifting from the mindset that camps should always remain temporary to actually allowing them become permanent. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. It is happening, and it's an important change. I think we can agree to that. What do you say?
Well, your question touches on the issue that we started with, and that's what is temporary and what is permanent, and challenging the tented city, and taking a view where you encourage a greater degree of permanence, because the reality, as you quite rightly state, is that it's there for a very long time. And if you come back to dignity and you want privacy, then acoustic privacy, a thin wall, is not the greatest insulator against your neighbor. And one of the things that we've been exploring in this workshop is the way in which we can equate thermal mass with some of the new materials which give us mass and give it to us quickly, using less water and using the materials to hand. So I think it's facing up to the reality that these are long-term communities. They're not just a bunch of units. It's a bigger picture. And if the starting point is that bigger picture, rather than the starting point is a single tent and how many do we need, you know, you've challenged that, and we're challenging now what you've been doing. And it's been incredible that you've gifted with IKEA your typical unit, which looks as though it's site-specific in our courtyard.
Yeah. No, it's very, very true. Thank you. I think one question I will add to this element is that we're thinking of like permanent in terms of that planning will be long-term. One of the key challenges, if I just want to paint one of the challenges for us to get here, is that funding is often far from permanent. Typically in an emergency, you get the highest funding at the peak of the emergency. If you look at Haiti, it's a prime example. You know, there were more like aid workers and toilets in Haiti at the prime, right? It was flooded with stuff. Look at it today. I think so. One thing that I would encourage all architects in this room is that when working with humanitarian architecture, is that whatever you ship to the disaster site, even if it's the early temporary solutions you're having, try to ensure that it has a value long term. Maybe not for its original purpose, but that you can reuse it or modify it or use it for something else. Because what we are seeing in so many operations is that there is not more funding coming. And I think we can all look at the news and remember last year. 1 year ago, it was the 10th, we cannot say anniversary of the Syria crisis, but that was it was. It was in the news a lot. Then Afghanistan, the Taliban took over, it collapses. Media went there, funding went there. Now Ukraine. The other conflicts in Yemen have not been resolved, but they're not receiving the funding. So I think one critical thing I would like to encourage you to take with you is that to have this mindset of whether you're sourcing locally or what you're doing, try to provide a long-term value, because it's not sure, by far from sure, certain that the UN will be there tomorrow or any other national organization or NGO. Shigeru Ban?
Well,
any thoughts on the final thoughts here? We're about to close, so just about the thinking of these camps, more as settlements, I would assume, and allowing them to be permanent.
The duration is so much political, actually. It's not about the duration of the structure itself. So that is a little bit out of our role. The deciding the duration, temporary, permanent, is not something we can decide. That is why even when I design the temporary houses, I respect the local regulation, and I work with a good structure engineer to keep the safety. And because it's the respect the local regulation and the safety, this can be permanent. Because whether it's temporary or permanent is not about the durability of the material or system. It's about more the political decision or community over the people love the structure or not. So this duration is not about the structure.
No.
So,
It's about the political will to make it happen.
unfortunately, yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
We need architects to be politicians.
We do need more, more architects in government. That's all right. I think that was an excellent final quote. So thank you very much. And we have a photo opportunity now. Wow, great. So it's,
Button my coat. You come in the middle.
Come on. I've been asked to move.
all right.
Thank you.
All right.
Good.
Right. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.